You might not be familiar with it, but this is quite possibly the most important single transit line in the world. This line opened in 1885, and it has just 30 stations, and yet it moves millions of people every single day. In fact, this line alone moves more people than the Chicago L and likely even the Berlin U-Bahn system. Exact numbers aren't really known, but I'll address that later in the video. So where does it go, how does it do it, and what can we learn from this incredible transit line? All of that and more in today's video about the incredible Yamanote Line. The first thing that I think would surprise a lot of people about the Yamanote Line is that unlike many of the most heavily used urban rail systems around the world, from the Lexington Avenue line in New York to the Paris RER and the Munich S-Bahn, is that the Yamanote Line is entirely above ground, along its 34.5-kilometer looping alignment around central Tokyo. And the Yamanote Line basically entirely runs in larger surface rail corridors, and sometimes elevated among Japan's famous missing middle density, which I'll point out has not destroyed any neighborhoods. In fact, quite the opposite, with retail under the viaducts and embankments, and huge stations being the center point of Tokyo. In many ways, the railway is actually the focal point of most neighborhoods. Now, because of the surface-running rail corridor alignment, the Yamanote Line is often considered in conjunction with other services which run alongside it, to which transfers can often be easily made by doing either an up and over or down and under transfer. For most of the eastern leg, the Yamanote Line runs inside the Keihin Tohoku line, giving it cross-platform transfers with that line at 13 different stations, though these mainly serve just to provide additional capacity rather than convenient transfers, though they do also do that. Meanwhile, at Shinjuku, famously the busiest train station in the entire world, the Yamanote Line has cross-platform transfers with the major Chuosobu line. That's all enabled by a number of major flyovers and flyunders, which alongside giant station structures, like at the aforementioned Shinjuku, is really the only time the Yamanote Line goes under much of anything. One unfortunate thing is that while connection to other JR services is usually pretty good, sometimes when you're transferring to other railways, a lot of winding corridors and walking is required. On another point, when I say around central Tokyo, I don't really mean around in the sense of encirclement, like you see with looping rail lines such as the Berlin Ringbahn or the Delhi Pink Line. Instead, the Yamanote Line travels to many key commercial nodes around central Tokyo, arguably traveling from one to another of Tokyo's multiple central business districts. It's sort of like the Circle Line in London, but not underground and much better connected. Now, to be fair, the Yamanote Line, like most circle lines, does not form a perfect circle, or really anything close to one. Since it primarily runs within the two major north-south mainline rail corridors in central Tokyo, the Yamanote Line sort of forms a bit of a heart shape, with the two portions meeting at the southern end near Osaki and cutting across the loop alongside the Shonan Shinjuku Line at the north. If you want more details about how the Tokyo Urban Rail Network works, I made an entire video that is just dedicated to explaining it, so you can check that out at the link in the top right corner. One of the major notable features of the Yamanote Line is just how many of its stations are connection points. Out of the 30 that exist on the line, only 2 do not have connections to another urban rail line. By comparison, the Circle Line in London has quite a few that don't have connections to other rail lines. At the same time, more than 20 of the stations on the Yamanote Line connect to at least 3 other rail services. It's just an incredibly well-connected service. Part of this is because, thanks to its excellent corridors, the Yamanote Line connects to 6 major stations within central Tokyo: Ueno, Ikebukuro, Shinjuku, Shibuya, Shinagawa, and Tokyo. One of the most amazing things about the line is that thanks to its impeccable coverage of central Tokyo, many tourists and visitors to Tokyo can get away with basically only using the Yamanote Line when they're in town. Tokyo Station, the Imperial Palace, Ueno Park, Akihabara, Shinjuku, Shibuya, Harajuku, many sporting venues, the waterfront, and a lot more are all accessible a short walk away from Yamanote Line stations. And since the Yamanote Line is a JR service, it's covered by the JR Pass. I have an affiliate link for the JR Pass down in the description below that if you use will help out the channel, so if you're planning on visiting Japan soon, take a look at it. Now, to move so many people, the Yamanote Line needs a lot of service, and during most of the day, you'll never wait more than 5 minutes for a train. During peak periods, you can wait as little as 2 minutes for the next train. And these frequencies are going to be made even more consistent with the introduction of automatic train operation on the line, which has been ongoing for the last couple of years. Despite the very high frequencies, the trains on the Yamanote Line are not small, they're enormous. Roughly 3 meters wide, which looks hilarious riding on the only a little more than 1 meter wide tracks that make up the mainline network in Japan, and 11 cars or over 220 meters long, with basically 100% bench seating as you would expect. When JR East considers ridership, they're mainly thinking about the reality of crowding on trains and overall ridership along major corridors rather than on independent services. And with these huge 11-car trains being very crowded during peak periods and just generally busy for most of the day, while also running every few minutes, we can say with confidence that the ridership on the Yamanote Line is enormous. Some folks were surprised when I mentioned digital advertising boards in a recent video that mentioned the New York subway. And they mentioned how much they dislike advertising, which is an understandable perspective. Part of the reason I think that this isn't something that I really paid much mind to is that in Japan, the advertising on trains tends to go a lot further. Digital video ads in Japan, and of course on the Yamanote Line, are not something new. And ads are also placed in all kinds of other places, from the ends of the cars, to on the doors themselves, to even sometimes on the handholds and hanging from the ceiling. My personal view is that ads can often add an interesting element to riding the world's urban rail systems, especially if you're traveling from city to city, but I do think that it's important that we become cognizant of the fact that they can be really agitating to people because it's just a lot of stimulation, so it's a worthy consideration for the future. Oh, of course, not to mention the ads on the outside of the trains themselves. I guess ultimately I just don't notice the ads so much in other systems because once you've seen what they have in Japan, nothing else is really nearly as in your face. The stations are also, of course, very important, and most are quite old and very heavily used, which you can often see visually in things like the canopies and the support columns. At the same time, despite the very high ridership and high quality of these services, platforms are often quite narrow and even fairly curved. Despite all of this, they're generally in very good condition. And the wayfinding tends to be pretty good in my personal opinion. In Japan, there's not just tactile wayfinding at the edges of the platforms, but also that leads you through the stations and out onto the sidewalk and beyond. At the same time, despite the congested platforms and the many columns that exist, basically all of the Yamanote Line stations have platform gates, which protect you from falling onto the tracks or dropping things onto the tracks, which keeps service reliable. This also allows the gigantic trains to enter the stations much faster than they would otherwise be able to, since they don't have to worry about the wind knocking passengers off their feet and potentially onto the tracks. At the same time, not every station on the line is totally old. Harajuku Station has been renovated since I last visited, and for the 2020 Olympics, which were actually in 2021, there was even a brand new station built, Takanawa Gateway. Now, of course, the ultimate question is how this line manages to move so many people every single day. More people than live in many entire cities. I've actually discussed this topic before, but it really does bear repeating. With any transit line, you have vehicles traveling along the line, moving passengers. In the case of the Yamanote Line, moving around a big loop. The ability for the line to move passengers, and arguably be useful to passengers, is highly dependent on how many trips can realistically be made as a vehicle travels around or along the line. Now, obviously, one way a transit line can be useful is if it travels from a suburban area or an area of lower density towards a denser one or one with more commercial activity, offices and otherwise. And because of this, people often get really into the idea of density around transit, which is definitely something we should have more of. But the reality is that a high-rise tower, or even a bunch of high-rise towers, can only have so many residents. If you're wondering, office towers are much better because you can put more desks in a tower than you can put apartments. What can bring far more people to a transit stop is other transit services. A single high-rise apartment can deliver less people to a rail station than even a moderately used bus line. And since the Yamanote Line doesn't just have other transit lines, but other major urban rail lines connecting to it at almost every single stop, it has an unending stream of passengers to move about central Tokyo. And that means even just traveling from one station to the next, almost every single segment of the Yamanote Line route could be a useful trip for someone to make, even if only to connect between two other services. This means that while radial lines traveling from the city center to less dense areas might be able to transport one group of people going into the city and another group of people going out, with a circular line, a large portion of passengers can get on and off the train at every single station, which means that just one loop of the tracks for a single train could easily move as many people on the Yamanote Line as entirely different transit lines all day. Now you might argue that this is simply a downfall of the way that we measure ridership, and you're not entirely wrong. Is ridership nearly as valuable if each person isn't traveling as far when they ride? Well, arguably that might actually be the case, because if people can take short trips on transit conveniently, that probably means you have excellent land use, where a lot of people could probably just walk, cycle, or take another mode of transportation. At the same time, looping lines, or just lines that connect to other lines in general, tend to not be useful just because they themselves are a valuable transportation artery, but because they connect and enhance other transportation arteries. If someone transfers off of a north-south rail line in Tokyo onto the Yamanote Line, that frees up a seat for someone else to get onto that rail line and ride in, boosting its ridership as well. All of this is a true instance of why creating a true transit network is more important than just collecting a bunch of lines together. Whatever your opinion, I think it would be hard to make a case that any other urban rail line in the world is more important to its city than the Yamanote Line is to Tokyo. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks to JR Urbane Network and Shin for all of their footage on the ground of the Yamanote Line that was used in this video.